What happens when a wealthy real estate developer tries to force an 80-year-old Vietnam veteran and his wife, who battles Alzheimer's, out of their home in the dead of winter, all so he can flip the property for profit? A 45-year-old landlord walked into Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom, acting like his money, contracts, and confidence would guarantee him the outcome he wanted. But when Judge Caprio asked the veteran to say his name, then slowly rose from the bench with tears forming in his eyes, the entire courtroom felt the shift. What followed became one of the most unforgettable emotional moments in Providence history, a moment where the law met humanity, and humanity won. And before we continue, tell us in the comments, which qualities of Judge Frank Caprio do you admire the most? His compassion, his fairness, or his courage to speak truth, even to the powerful? Before we dive deep, you're watching Case Closed, the channel that brings you the most powerful courtroom stories inspired by Judge Frank Caprio's legacy of compassion and real justice. It's a cold January morning in Providence Municipal Court. Judge Frank Caprio reviews a case that has generated significant community concern. Richard Brennan, age 45, a real estate investor and property developer, versus George Sullivan, age 80, regarding an eviction notice and unlawful detainer. The case file tells a disturbing story. Richard Brennan owns a 3-story apartment building on Federal Hill that he purchased 8 months ago as an investment property. The building, constructed in 1952, currently houses 6 elderly tenants, most of whom have lived there for decades with rent-controlled leases. Brennan wants to convert the building into luxury condominiums. Market analysis suggests he could sell each unit for $800,000 to $1.2 million. But there's a problem. The current tenants, particularly George Sullivan, who has lived in apartment 2B for 23 years. George Sullivan is an 80-year-old Vietnam War veteran who served 2 tours from 1966 to 1968. He lives with his wife, Dorothy Sullivan, age 78, who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease 4 years ago and requires constant care. George's rent is $850 per month under a rent-controlled agreement that predates Brennan's ownership. His lease is legally valid and protected under Rhode Island tenant rights laws. But Brennan wants him out. 8 months ago, immediately after purchasing the building, Brennan began what tenants describe as a campaign of harassment, cutting heat during winter cold snaps, claiming the boiler needed repairs that took weeks, shutting off water for emergency plumbing work that somehow always occurred during evenings and weekends, entering apartments for inspections without proper notice. For George Sullivan, these disruptions have been devastating. Dorothy's Alzheimer's means she becomes confused and frightened by any change in routine. The lack of heat triggered a health emergency that sent her to the hospital for 3 days with pneumonia. The water shutoffs meant George couldn't maintain her hygiene care schedule, causing skin infections. 6 weeks ago, Brennan served George with an eviction notice, claiming the apartment needed extensive renovations for safety code violations. The violations listed were minor issues like a loose cabinet hinge and a dripping faucet that George had reported for repair multiple times. George, with help from a legal aid attorney, fought the eviction. Rhode Island law provides strong protections for elderly tenants, particularly those with medical needs. But Brennan has expensive lawyers and endless resources to drag this through court. Now, they're here before Judge Caprio for a hearing on the eviction order. Richard Brennan enters the courtroom wearing an expensive suit and Rolex watch, projecting wealth and confidence. His attorney, Marcus Reed, from one of Providence's most aggressive real estate law firms, carries a briefcase full of paperwork designed to overwhelm opposition with legal complexity. Behind them, moving slowly, comes George Sullivan. He's thin, his Vietnam veteran cap slightly too large for his head. He's holding the arm of a young woman, a volunteer from the Veteran Services Office who helped him get to court because he can no longer drive safely. George looks exhausted. The stress of fighting this eviction while caring for Dorothy has aged him years and months. Judge Caprio watches George's entrance carefully, Something about the elderly veteran looks familiar, but he can't immediately place it. The bailiff calls the case. Judge Caprio reviews the eviction petition, his expression growing increasingly skeptical as he reads Brennan's claims. "Mr. Brennan," Judge Caprio begins, "you're seeking to evict an 80-year-old veteran who has lived in your building for 23 years because of a loose cabinet hinge and a dripping faucet?" Brennan's attorney stands quickly. "Your Honor, the property requires extensive renovations to meet modern safety standards. Mr. Sullivan's apartment needs complete updating. We've offered him compensation to relocate voluntarily, but he's refused to cooperate." Judge Caprio looks at George. "Mr. Sullivan, have you been offered compensation?" George's voice is quiet but steady. "Yes, Your Honor. He offered me $3,000 to move out by the end of the month. But I can't move my wife, Dorothy. She has Alzheimer's. Any change in her environment causes severe confusion and distress. Our doctor says moving her could accelerate her cognitive decline significantly. If you're not subscribed, hit that button right now, because what happens next will show you what happens when greed meets a judge who understands what home means to elderly people." Judge Caprio asked to see the alleged safety violations. Brennan's attorney produces photographs. Judge Caprio examines them carefully. A cabinet door slightly askew, a faucet with mineral deposits, a window that sticks slightly when opening. "Mr. Brennan, these are minor maintenance issues, not safety emergencies. Why haven't you simply repaired them?" Brennan speaks for the first time, his voice carrying an edge of impatience. "Your Honor, the entire building needs updating. These units have rent-controlled tenants paying 1990s rates. The property can't generate appropriate returns with these restrictions. I have a right to maximize my investment." Judge Caprio's expression hardens. "You have a right to maximize your investment by evicting an 80-year-old veteran and his wife with Alzheimer's in January. It's business, Your Honor, nothing personal." Judge Caprio sets down the paperwork. "Mr. Sullivan, can you tell me about your wife's condition?" George's voice becomes heavy with emotion. "Dorothy was a nurse for 35 years, Your Honor. Sharpest person I ever knew. Now she can't remember our daughter's name half the time, but she knows our apartment. She knows where the bathroom is, where her chair by the window sits, where we keep her medications. If I move her somewhere new, she'll be completely lost. The doctor says the stress could cause a catastrophic decline." He continues, "We've been in that apartment since 1999. Dorothy picked out every piece of furniture. She painted the kitchen yellow because it reminded her of her mother's kitchen. Moving her would be like erasing the last connection she has to herself." The courtroom is silent. Even Brennan's attorney looks uncomfortable. Judge Caprio asks, "Mr. Sullivan, what is your address?" 243 Atwells Avenue, Your Honor, apartment 2B. Judge Caprio freezes. His face goes pale. He slowly stands up from his bench and walks around to the front. 243 Atwells Avenue. The old brick building across from the Pasquale Square? Yes, Your Honor. 3 stories? 6 apartments. Judge Caprio's voice becomes thick with emotion. "Mr. Sullivan, how long did you say you've lived there?" 23 years, sir. "And before you moved in, did you know the previous tenant in that apartment?" George looks confused. "I don't think so, Your Honor. The landlord at the time said the previous family had moved out about a year before." Judge Caprio walks closer to George. "Mr. Sullivan, I need to tell you something. I grew up in that building. My family lived in apartment 2B from 1946 until 1968. That was our home." The courtroom is stunned into absolute silence. Judge Caprio continues, his voice breaking slightly. "My father was a fruit vendor. We didn't have much money. But that apartment, it was small, but it was ours. My mother cooked in that kitchen. My sister and I did our homework at the table by the window. I learned to ride a bike on that street." George stares at Judge Caprio, trying to process this revelation. "And, Mr. Sullivan," Judge Caprio says, tears now visible in his eyes, "there was a man in our building when I was a boy, a veteran who had just come back from Vietnam. He lived on the first floor. He used to give me and the other neighborhood kids candy, tell us to stay in school, stay out of trouble. He was kind when he didn't have to be kind. Judge Caprio looks directly at George. Was that you, Mr. Sullivan? Were you in that building in the late 1960s? George's eyes widen with recognition. I moved into apartment 1A in 1968 when I came back from Vietnam. I lived there until 1999. When I moved upstairs to 2B after I married Dorothy, Caprio's voice breaks completely. Mr. Sullivan, do you remember the Caprio family, the fruit vendor's family in 2B? George's face transforms with sudden recognition. Little Frankie! Little Frankie! Caprio, who wanted to be a lawyer. Judge Caprio nods, unable to speak for a moment. George continues, his own voice now thick with emotion. I remember you. You were maybe 8, 9 years old. Smart kid, always reading. Your father was so proud of you. He pauses. Your father, he had a heart attack on the street one summer. I was there. I did CPR until the ambulance came. Did he survived. Judge Caprio says quietly. Thanks to you. He lived another 30 years, and he never stopped talking about the veteran who saved his life. That was you, Mr. Sullivan. You saved my father's life. The courtroom erupts in gasps and whispers. Richard Brennan looks like he wants to disappear. Judge Caprio walks over to George Sullivan and does something extraordinary. He embraces the elderly veteran. Mr. Sullivan, you saved my father's life. You gave candy to neighborhood kids when you barely had money for yourself. You were kind to a family struggling to survive. And now someone wants to throw you out of the home you've lived in for 23 years so he can make a profit? Judge Caprio turns to Richard Brennan, and the warmth is completely gone from his voice. Mr. Brennan, do you understand what you're trying to do? You're trying to evict a man who served this country, who saved lives, who has been a good tenant for over 2 decades. You're trying to force an 80-year-old man to move his wife with Alzheimer's in the middle of winter. For what? So you can convert apartments into luxury condos? Brennan tries to respond. Your Honor, I understand this is emotional, but legally... Legally? Judge Caprio interrupts. Let me tell you about legally, Mr. Brennan. Rhode Island General Laws, Chapter 3418, provides extensive protections for elderly tenants. Section 341824 specifically prohibits eviction of tenants over 62 for purposes of property conversion unless you provide suitable alternative housing at comparable rent. Judge Caprio picks up the case file. Did you provide Mr. Sullivan with comparable housing? We offered him $3,000 to relocate. Brennan's attorney interjects. $3,000? Judge Caprio's voice rises. To move an 80-year-old man and his wife with Alzheimer's to find a new apartment, pay deposits, moving costs, and somehow care for a woman whose health depends on environmental stability? That's not suitable alternative housing. That's an insult. Judge Caprio reviews the evidence systematically. The alleged safety violations are trivial maintenance issues. The heat shutoffs during winter endangered elderly tenants. The water disruptions violated habitability standards. The harassment constitutes retaliation for George refusing to vacate. The ruling Judge Caprio delivers is comprehensive and devastating to Brennan. First, the eviction petition is denied. Mr. Sullivan's lease is valid and protected under Rhode Island tenant protection laws. He will remain in apartment 2B2. Mr. Brennan, you are ordered to immediately repair all maintenance issues in Mr. Sullivan's apartment and throughout the building. You have 14 days. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $500. Third, you are ordered to pay Mr. Sullivan $5,000 in damages for the harassment, the heat shutoffs that caused his wife's hospitalization, and the emotional distress of this eviction attempt. Fourth, you are prohibited from raising Mr. Sullivan's rent above the rent-controlled rate for the duration of his tenancy. Any attempt to circumvent this through fees or surcharges will result in contempt charges. Fifth, you will provide me with quarterly reports proving you are maintaining the building properly and not harassing elderly tenants. Brennan's face goes red. Your Honor, this is outrageous. I have property rights. You have responsibilities, Mr. Brennan. When you bought that building, you bought it subject to existing leases and tenant rights. You don't get to destroy people's lives for profit. Judge Caprio's voice becomes even more forceful. Mr. Sullivan saved my father's life. He was kind to me when I was a child. He served this country in Vietnam. He has cared for his wife with Alzheimer's with devotion that most people can't imagine, and you thought you could throw him out like garbage because luxury condos are more profitable than rent-controlled apartments? He leans forward. Let me be absolutely clear, Mr. Brennan. If you try this again, if you harass Mr. Sullivan or any other elderly tenant in that building, I will hold you in contempt. I will find you personally, and I will make sure every judge in Providence knows exactly what kind of landlord you are. Court is adjourned. As Brennan storms out, George Sullivan approaches Judge Caprio. Your Honor, I don't know what to say. You didn't have to do this. Judge Caprio takes George's hands in his. Mr. Sullivan, you saved my father. You saved me from growing up without a father. This isn't about gratitude, this is about what's right. You and Dorothy deserve to live in peace in the home you've made together. George's eyes fill with tears. Dorothy doesn't understand what's been happening. She just keeps asking when the nice man is going to fix the heat. I didn't know how to explain to her that someone wanted to take away our home. She'll never have to know, Judge Caprio says gently. You're staying, and Mr. Brennan is going to make sure that building is properly maintained. 3 days later, contractors arrive at 243 Atwells Avenue. Within a week, every maintenance issue in the building is repaired. The heat works perfectly. The water runs hot and consistent. The building, for the first time in 8 months, feels like a home again. Richard Brennan completes the repairs as ordered. His quarterly reports show full compliance. He stops pursuing evictions. 6 months later, he sells the building to a nonprofit organization that specializes in affordable housing for elderly residents. George Sullivan continues living in apartment 2B with Dorothy. Neighborhood volunteers inspired by the news coverage of the case organize a care support network. People bring meals, sit with Dorothy so George can rest, help with errands. Dorothy's condition continues to decline as Alzheimer's inevitably does, but she declines in the home she knows, surrounded by things that comfort her, cared for by the husband who refuses to give up on her. 1 year after the hearing, Judge Caprio visits 243 Atwells Avenue. He brings flowers for Dorothy and a framed photograph he found in his mother's belongings. A picture from 1968 showing young Frank Caprio, age 9, standing in front of the building with George Sullivan, who had just returned from Vietnam, giving him and other neighborhood kids candy. George looks at the photograph, tears streaming down his face. I forgot this. I forgot being that young man who just came home. You remember better than I do. Judge Caprio smiles. You were a hero then, and you're a hero now. Taking care of Dorothy the way you do, that's love. That's sacrifice. They sit together in the apartment, in the kitchen with the yellow walls that Dorothy painted, and Judge Caprio tells George stories about his father, about growing up in that building,
about how a veteran's kindness to a neighborhood kid helped shape the judge he became. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible courtroom moments where judges like Frank Caprio prove that justice isn't just about law. It's about humanity, gratitude, and protecting people who can't protect themselves. If you believe that forcing an 80-year-old veteran and his wife with Alzheimer's out of their home just to make a profit exposes a person's true character, make sure to hit that like button. And tell us in the comments, did Richard Brennan get exactly what he deserved? Because this story isn't just about an eviction, it's about dignity. It's about the value of a home, and it's about remembering that behind every legal case are human beings who deserve respect, especially those who have already given so much. Decades ago, George Sullivan saved Judge Frank Caprio's father's life. 55 years later, Judge Caprio stood up in that courtroom and protected George's home. That isn't coincidence. That's loyalty. That's justice. And that is the legacy Judge Frank Caprio leaves behind. A legacy built on compassion, gratitude, and a belief that the law should always serve people, not harm them.
If you want more powerful stories that honor that legacy, make sure you subscribe to Case Closed, where real justice lives on through every story we tell.